Teenagers. They're supposed to be in classrooms, at football games, texting friends late into the night. But in America, some teenage girls traded homework for handcuffs. And their sentences weren't months or years. They were forever. Behind prison walls across the country are young women who committed crimes so shocking, so brutal, that they will never walk free again. They weren't yet old enough to vote. Some weren't even old enough to drive. Yet they carried out murders that rival the darkest crimes in history. These are not cautionary tales of mischief gone wrong. These are stories of teenage girls who destroyed families, silenced parents, and executed strangers. And their names will forever be tied to the lives they ended. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, what time are you watching this video? And where in the world are you watching from? Because no matter what time it is, or what city you're in, by the end of this video, you'll never look at fame the same way again. 1. Natasha Cornett.
18-year-old Natasha Cornett, the woman who tells her attorney she is the Antichrist, was next. In
the quiet hills of rural Tennessee, where country churches dot the landscape and families gather on Sunday afternoons, a storm was brewing. Natasha Cornett, just 18 years old, was at the center of it. She wasn't like the others her age. She dyed her hair dark, wore black clothes, and wrote about death in her journal. She called herself a queen of the underworld, a ruler of shadows. But her fascination with darkness wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was a prelude to something far more sinister. Natasha had always felt like an outcast. She grew up in poverty, shunned by classmates, carrying the weight of a childhood marked by instability and bullying. By the time she hit high school, she was already experimenting with drugs, alcohol, and the occult. Teachers described her as intelligent but disturbed, a girl who seemed to be slipping through the cracks. And then she met others like her, teenagers who also felt alienated, angry, and eager to break free from the small town that held them. Together, they formed a dangerous bond. In April 1997, 6 young people, Natasha and her group of outcasts, stole a car and set out on what they called a road trip to freedom. They wanted to leave Tennessee, to find a new life somewhere else. But somewhere along the highway, their hunger for freedom turned into a plan for violence. They didn't just want escape, they wanted power. And that craving for control led them straight into the path of an unsuspecting family. On a Sunday evening, the Lillelid family, Vidar, his wife Delphina, and their 2 children, Tabitha, age 6, and Peter, just 2 years old, were returning home from a religious gathering. The picture of innocence, a kind father with a heavy Norwegian accent, a devoted mother, and 2 small children buckled into their seats. When their van slowed near a rest stop, Natasha and her group approached. At first, it looked like a simple carjacking. But within moments, the situation spiraled into something darker. The Lillelids were forced into the van at gunpoint. Natasha and her crew wanted the family's vehicle to continue their escape. But what happened next went beyond theft. It became one of the most infamous family slayings in Tennessee history. The group drove the family down a secluded gravel road. Night was falling. The trees stood like silent witnesses. And there, on the edge of a rural ditch, the Lillelids were lined up as if they were enemy soldiers facing execution. The father, Vidar, pleaded with them. He begged for the lives of his children. He asked for mercy, reminding them that these were just babies. But Natasha and her companions showed none. Gunfire erupted. The bullets tore through the parents first, then the children. Delphina fell trying to shield her daughter. Little Tabitha was shot in the head. 2-year-old Peter was struck as well, his tiny body collapsing onto the earth. Vidar, riddled with bullets, crumpled beside them. It was a bloodbath, and it lasted only seconds. But when the smoke cleared, One horrifying detail set this massacre apart. Tabitha was gone. Delphina was gone. Vidar was gone. But Peter, the toddler, was still alive. He had been shot in the head, and his tiny frame was shattered by the violence. But somehow, against all odds, he survived. Permanently disabled, blind in one eye, paralyzed on one side, his small body became living evidence of the cruelty Natasha and her group had unleashed. The teenagers fled, abandoning the bodies in the ditch, stealing the family's van, and heading south. They thought they were free on their way to Mexico to start a new life, but freedom was an illusion. Authorities across multiple states tracked them as the Lillelid murders made national headlines. By the time they reached the Mexican border, police were waiting. Natasha Cornett and her companions were captured and hauled back to Tennessee in shackles. The trial that followed gripped the entire state. Natasha, with her black lipstick and defiant stare, looked every bit the role of a dark queen who had orchestrated a massacre. Prosecutors painted her as the ringleader, the one who craved blood and power. The defense argued she was troubled, mentally ill, and had been swept up in a group dynamic she couldn't control. But the evidence was overwhelming. The Lillelid family had been executed in cold blood. In 1998, Natasha Cornett stood before the court and pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. She was sentenced to life without parole, a teenager condemned to spend the rest of her days behind steel and concrete. Today, she sits in prison, her body older, but her crime forever frozen in time. For the Lillelids, there was no appeal, no second chance. Vidar and Delphina were buried together, their daughter Tabitha beside them. Peter survived, but his life was forever marked by that night, his childhood stolen in an instant of senseless violence. And Natasha Cornett, once a lonely teenager chasing the shadows, became something else entirely. The name forever tied to a massacre that shattered an entire family on a Tennessee back road. 2. Karen Howell. She wasn't the ringleader. She wasn't the one people pointed to with fear in their eyes. Karen Howell was just 15, a high school sophomore who still carried the shy posture of a girl used to being overlooked. When news of the Lillelid murders broke across Tennessee, the headlines focused on Natasha Cornett, the self-styled Gothic queen. But behind the black lipstick and loud theatrics of Cornett was another teenager, quieter but no less guilty, whose name would be forever chained to the slaughter of a family on a rural back road. That name was Karen Howell. Karen grew up in Greenville, Tennessee, in a household that was fractured long before she joined Cornett's group of misfits. She was young, impressionable, and desperate to belong. Those who knew her described a girl who was easy to influence, someone who followed instead of led. But when she fell into the orbit of Natasha Cornett, she was pulled into a spiral that ended in one of the most infamous family murders in American history. By April of 1997, Karen was skipping school and running with the older group, Natasha, Edward Dean Mullins, Jason Bryant, and others. They spent their days dreaming of escape, of leaving their small town and starting over somewhere far away. Mexico was the fantasy destination, a place where nobody would judge them, where they could live free of rules. But the dream was stitched together with stolen cars, reckless ideas, and a hunger for power none of them knew how to handle. That Sunday evening, April 6th, the group's path crossed with the Lillelid family, Vidar and Delphina, their 6-year-old daughter Tabitha, and 2-year-old Peter were heading home from a religious event. They pulled into a rest area, their children strapped into the back seats of a white minivan, blissfully unaware of the danger that was about to descend on them. For the Lillelids, it was an ordinary drive. For Karen and her companions, it was the moment their fantasy turned into irreversible horror. Karen wasn't holding the gun when the Lillelids were forced into their own van. She wasn't the one giving orders as they drove the terrified family to a remote gravel road. but she was there. She watched as Vidar pleaded for his children's lives, his accent heavy, his desperation raw. She was there when the family was ordered out of the van and lined up near a ditch, like captives in a war they never signed up for. And she was there when the gunfire began. The shots echoed through the trees, merciless, close range, final. Vidar collapsed first, struck by multiple rounds. Delphina tried to shield Tabitha, but bullets tore through them both. Tabitha, only 6, fell alongside her mother. And then came Peter, the toddler whose baby clothes were stained with blood as a bullet ripped into his tiny frame. The air was thick with smoke and screams until silence smothered it all. The group believed they had killed them all. But Peter lived. Blind in one eye, partially paralyzed, his small body carried scars that would never heal. The massacre was supposed to be a clean escape with a stolen vehicle. Instead, it was carnage, leaving behind a ditch filled with death and a toddler clinging to life. Karen climbed into the van with the others. She didn't pull the trigger, but she didn't stop them either. Silence was her weapon. Silence as a family was destroyed. Silence as they fled in the Lillelid's vehicle. Silence as they headed for the Mexican border in a stolen dream. When police captured the 6 at the border days later, Karen looked nothing like a hardened killer. She was barely more than a child, her face soft, her voice quiet, her hands trembling. But in the eyes of the law, she was no different than the ones who fired the shots. She had been part of the group. She had participated in the kidnapping, the abduction, the theft of the van. And under Tennessee law, that made her equally responsible for the murders. At trial, prosecutors hammered home this point. Karen Howell was not innocent just because she didn't pull the trigger. She had been there every step of the way. She had opportunities to leave, to warn the Lillelids, to break free. She had chosen not to. The jury heard testimony about her involvement, about the way she went along with the plan, about how she never once tried to stop what was happening. Karen eventually pleaded guilty, alongside the others, in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. 15 years old when she joined Cornett on that bloody road trip, she became one of the youngest females in Tennessee history to receive a life sentence. Today, Karen Howell remains behind prison walls, serving a sentence that will not end. She entered as a teenager. She will grow old there. She carries no notoriety like Cornett, no public identity as a dark queen or cult leader. Instead, she is remembered as the quiet accomplice, the girl who followed, the girl who listened, the girl who stayed silent while bullets ended the lives of a family who never even knew her name. The Lillelid's graves rest in Tennessee soil, marked by dates that stopped in 1997. Peter, the boy who survived, lives with the permanent scars of that night. And Karen Howell, once a shy 15-year-old searching for a place to belong, found it not in friendship, but in the shadow of a massacre that claimed everything from a family who had only been driving home. 3. Sarah Marie Johnson Bellevue, Idaho. A mountain town with postcard views, quiet streets, and neighbors who left their doors unlocked. It was the kind of place where trouble felt far away. But in September of 2003, that illusion shattered when a teenage girl named Sarah Marie Johnson turned her family home into a crime scene that stunned the nation. Sarah was 16, a high school sophomore with blonde hair and a typical suburban life. On the outside, she looked like any other teenager, juggling classes, friendships, and dreams of independence. But beneath the surface, Sarah was restless. She had fallen for an older man, a 19-year-old named Bruno Santos. Her parents, Alan and Diane, disapproved of the relationship. They worried about his influence, about his age, about where this path was leading their daughter. Sarah saw their warnings not as protection, but as prison bars. On the morning of September 2, 2003, Sarah decided she wasn't going to live under their rules any longer. She wasn't going to let them control her love life, her choices, her future. While her parents slept in the early morning hours, Sarah walked into their bedroom carrying a high-powered .22 to 64 caliber rifle that belonged to the family. She was calm, steady, focused. What happened next would leave investigators struggling to understand how a teenager could show so little hesitation in destroying the very people who gave her life. Alan Johnson, her father, was the first target. A respected local building contractor, he was still in bed when Sarah raised the rifle and fired. The blast was devastating, killing him instantly. Diane Johnson, her mother, was in the shower when she heard the shot. She barely had time to react before Sarah turned the rifle on her too. Diane's last moments were filled with confusion and fear as her daughter pulled the trigger again. The force of the blast was so violent that it left the small bathroom smeared in blood. It was over in seconds. Two parents dead at the hands of their own child. Sarah had wiped out her family tree with cold precision, but the most chilling part came after. Instead of collapsing in shock, instead of calling for help, Sarah tried to cover her tracks. She removed her bloody clothing, stashed it in a trash bag, and even placed the rifle outside by the fence in an attempt to stage the scene. She wanted it to look like an intruder had done it, some faceless stranger who had broken in while she was asleep. But investigators weren't convinced. The stage details were sloppy. The rifle was found right outside the property, too obvious to be believable. The trash bag with her clothes was quickly discovered. And when detectives questioned Sarah, her story unraveled under the weight of contradictions. Her tears seemed rehearsed. Her words lacked the raw confusion of a grieving daughter. Instead, what they saw was a teenager struggling to maintain a lie. The turning point came when forensic experts analyzed gunshot residue. Traces were found on Sarah's hands, proving she had fired the weapon. DNA evidence on the discarded clothing and rifle matched her as well. Every piece of evidence pointed back to the daughter of the victims. The community that had once seen her as a sweet small-town girl now saw her as a calculating killer. At trial, prosecutors revealed Sarah's motive: freedom to live with Bruno Santos. She believed that if her parents were gone, nothing could stop her relationship. It was teenage rebellion at its deadliest extreme. The belief that the only way out of parental rules was to eliminate the parents themselves. The courtroom listened as experts described the brutality of the shootings, the close range of the blasts, the way Diane had been cornered in her bathroom. The jury sat in silence as prosecutors laid out how a 16-year-old planned and executed the murder of her own family. Her defense argued immaturity, impulsiveness, a lack of fully formed judgment. They tried to frame her as a child who made a terrible mistake, not a monster deserving of the harshest punishment. But the jury saw the planning, the cover-up attempt, the gunshot residue. They saw intent. In 2005, Sarah Marie Johnson was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Her sentence: 2 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 15 years for using a firearm. She became one of the youngest women in Idaho history to be sentenced to spend her entire life behind bars. Today, Sarah sits in prison, her teenage years frozen in time. While others her age went to prom, graduated, and started families of their own, she was condemned to spend her life replaying the morning she silenced her parents forever. For Bellevue, Idaho, the shock has never fully faded. Alan and Diane were laid to rest in the same soil they had raised their daughter on, their community mourning not just their deaths, but the way they were taken. Not by illness, not by accident, but by the child they loved. Sarah Marie Johnson's story remains one of the most chilling examples of teenage parricide in American history. A reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from within the family itself. 4. Carly Madison Gregg.
Tonight, a Mississippi teen sentenced to life in prison without parole for murdering her mother and attempting to kill her stepfather.
We, the jury, sentenced the defendant, Carly Madison Gregg, to life imprisonment.
15-year-old shooter Carly Gregg sobbing in court as she learned her fate.
Carly Gregg is evil, and
In most families, the teenage years are a storm of slammed doors, sharp words, and late-night arguments. But in Louisville, Mississippi, one household fight in 2003 turned into something far deadlier. At the center was a 15-year-old girl named Carly Madison Gregg, a freshman in high school whose name would soon be tied to one of the most shocking parricide cases in the state's history. Carly had grown up in what appeared to be an ordinary Southern family, but inside the walls of her home, tension was constant. She clashed with her mother, Rebecca, over everything from school to friends to discipline. The arguments grew more heated as Carly slipped further into rebellion. For her, home wasn't a refuge, it was a battleground. And one night, that battle erupted into irreversible violence. On March 6, 2003, Carly was at home with her mother and stepfather, Bob. The evening began with another argument, the same cycle of accusations and resentment that had been building for months. But instead of yelling and slamming her bedroom door, Carly made a choice that would change the course of her life forever. She reached for a .22 caliber rifle inside the house. Her mother was the first target. Carly raised the rifle, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, striking Rebecca and sending her to the floor. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a warning. It was deliberate, an eruption of anger channeled through gunpowder and steel. When Bob rushed in, shocked by the sound and sight before him, Carly turned the rifle on him too. She fired, determined to silence him as well, but Bob survived. Wounded but alive, scrambling for safety as the house filled with echoes of gunfire. In that moment, the walls of their home, once filled with arguments and ordinary family life, became a crime scene, soaked in betrayal. A mother lay dying at the hands of her own daughter. A stepfather, bleeding, staggered into the night to seek help. And Carly, just 15 years old, stood in the wreckage of what she had done. The police arrived quickly after Bob's desperate call for help. When they entered the house, they found Rebecca Gregg's body. She had been shot dead by her own child. The rifle was recovered, the evidence undeniable. Carly was arrested that night, her hands still trembling, her life already sealed inside a prison cell she had yet to see. In the weeks that followed, Mississippi struggled to comprehend how a teenager could turn a gun on her own family. Prosecutors argued that Carly's actions were not impulsive, but intentional. She had armed herself, confronted her mother, and pulled the trigger with lethal purpose. The attempted killing of her stepfather showed that this wasn't a single act of rage, but a sequence of choices made with deadly clarity. Her defense tried to paint a different picture of a girl overwhelmed by turmoil at home, trapped in an environment of conflict she couldn't navigate. They spoke of immaturity, impulsiveness, and desperation. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence of her intent was too strong, the outcome too final. Carly Madison Gregg was convicted of murder and attempted murder. At 15 years old, she was sentenced to life in prison. Mississippi law ensured that she would never walk free again, no matter how young she had been when she pulled the trigger. Her future, high school, college, adulthood, was replaced with the monotony of prison walls. What makes Carly's case so haunting isn't just the crime itself, but the intimacy of it. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, or strangers clashing in the night. It was family. A daughter and a mother locked in conflict until one ended the other's life. It was a crime that cut through the very heart of what family is supposed to mean. Today, Carly remains behind bars in Mississippi, serving her sentence as the years slip past. She entered prison as a teenager and has grown into adulthood there. Each birthday marked not by celebration, but by the passage of time in confinement. For Bob Gregg, survival came with scars, both physical and emotional. He lived with the memory of that night, the moment his stepdaughter pointed a gun at him and pulled the trigger after killing his wife. For the community, the case left a wound that still lingers, the shock of realizing that a child, barely old enough to drive, was capable of murdering the very person who raised her. The story of Carly Madison Gregg is one of youthful rage turned lethal, of arguments that escalated beyond words into bullets. She was 15 when she pulled the trigger, but that decision froze her life forever, locking her into a sentence that stretches decades into the future. And in Mississippi, the memory of that night in 2003 remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the danger isn't a stranger breaking in from the outside. It's already inside the home. 5. Britnee Angelique Miller. Friendship is supposed to be a shield, a bond forged by trust, laughter, and secrets whispered in confidence. But for one teenager in Jacksonville, Florida, that shield was nothing more than bait. In 2004, Britnee Angelique Miller proved that sometimes the person you think of as your closest friend can be the one who leads you straight into danger. Britnee was just 17. She wasn't a hardened criminal, not someone with years of violence behind her. On the surface, she looked like a normal Florida teenager, hanging out with friends, chasing attention, drifting through the last years of high school. But beneath that surface, she harbored jealousy and a taste for control. And when she set her sights on another girl, a girl who trusted her, that jealousy became a weapon. The victim was her peer, another teenager who saw Britnee as a friend. The two shared moments like countless high school girls do. Gossip about crushes, dreams about the future, the illusion that they were safe in each other's company. That illusion shattered on the night Britnee made her move. She lured her friend out under the guise of hanging out, the way they always did. It was nothing unusual, nothing that would set off alarm bells. That's what made it so deadly. Britnee knew her target wouldn't suspect betrayal, wouldn't expect to be walking into an ambush. It wasn't rage in the heat of the moment. It was pre-planned, deliberate. The details of that night read like a script of deception. They drove together, laughter still on the victim's lips, trust still intact. Then the trap closed. Britnee and her accomplices turned on her. The betrayal was swift, the violence brutal. The friend who had walked out the door expecting a night of fun found herself fighting for her life, surrounded by people she thought she knew. When the attack was over, the girl was dead. A teenager with plans, a future, and a life ahead of her. Erased by someone she once trusted to protect her secrets, Britnee had orchestrated the entire thing. The body was left discarded, and the killers carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But in the silence that followed, their crime screamed louder than anything. It didn't take long for investigators to piece together the truth. Text messages, witness statements, and the trail of betrayal all pointed straight back to Britnee. She hadn't just participated, she had been the architect, the one who lured her friend to her death. That betrayal struck the community like a hammer. How could one teenage girl plot the death of another she had laughed with in school hallways? At trial, prosecutors painted Britnee as the manipulator, the mastermind behind the murder. They argued that the crime was not a sudden eruption of anger, but a calculated plan carried out by a girl who understood the power of trust and how to exploit it. The jury listened to evidence that revealed how Britnee had baited her friend into the deadly meeting, how she had turned friendship into a snare. The defense tried to soften her image, portraying Britnee as a child who had been influenced by others, caught up in something bigger than herself. But the jury wasn't convinced. The betrayal was too sharp, the evidence too clear. Britnee Angelique Miller was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 17 years old, and her entire adult life was destined to unfold behind bars. The same age when most teenagers are buying prom dresses and filling out college applications. She was fitted instead for prison blues. Today, she sits in a Florida correctional facility, another inmate number in a system filled with names. But outside those walls, her victim's name lives on as a reminder of the bond that was broken in the worst way. A friendship that should have carried into adulthood ended in a grave. What makes Britnee's case so haunting isn't just the violence, but the intimacy of the betrayal. It wasn't a stranger on a dark street or an intruder breaking into a home. It was a girl's own friend, someone she trusted completely, who led her to her death. In Jacksonville, that memory still cuts deep. Parents warned their daughters to be careful, to look more closely at the people they called friends. Teachers spoke in hushed tones about the trial. And an entire community wrestled with the horror of realizing that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't a shadowy figure lurking outside. It's the person walking beside you, smiling, holding your trust in her hands. Britnee Miller's name will always be tied to that betrayal. A teenager who turned companionship into a death sentence, who sits in prison today because she proved that even friendship can be a mask for murder. 6. Shavonne Robbins. Some crimes begin with ambition, others with jealousy. But the story of Shavonne Robbins began with something far smaller, a desperate need for money. She wasn't a violent gang leader or a seasoned criminal. She was 16, a teenager from Philadelphia, who fell into the orbit of someone older, someone already hardened by street life. And when she followed his lead into what she thought would be a quick robbery, she stepped into a nightmare that would seal her fate forever. The plan was simple, or so she thought. A robbery, quick and clean. Grab what they could, get out, and disappear back into the city. To a restless teenager, it felt like a thrill, a rebellion against the monotony of daily life. But robberies rarely go as planned. And that night in 1991, the thrill turned into a murder that no one could undo. Her accomplice was older, the kind of figure who seemed larger than life to a girl like Shavonne. He promised money, excitement, a way to step out of the shadows of adolescence and into the dangerous glow of adulthood. Shavonne followed, not realizing that the choice she made that night would end her freedom before she was even old enough to finish high school. The two set their sights on a man they believed would be easy prey, a robbery target, nothing more. But once the confrontation began, control slipped away. Words escalated, fear sharpened, and in a single violent moment, the robbery became a killing. A life was taken in the middle of the chaos. And though Shavonne's hands may not have held the weapon, she was part of the crime, bound to it by law and by conscience. The victim's death sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was a reminder of how fragile life can be when violence is invited in. Shavonne didn't run the streets with power. She wasn't feared. She was just a teenager swept into something she couldn't control. And yet, she was still accountable for the result. When police closed in, it didn't take long for Shavonne to be arrested alongside her accomplice. Her age didn't shield her from the consequences. The courts saw not a child, but a participant in a crime that ended in death. Under Pennsylvania's felony murder law, anyone involved in a felony that causes a death is just as guilty as the one who delivered the fatal blow. The trial was sobering. Prosecutors made it clear whether Shavonne pulled the trigger or not didn't matter. She chose to take part in a robbery that ended with a man lying dead. The law didn't ask who fired the shot. It asked who was there, who helped make it happen. And Shavonne was there. Her defense tried to paint her as a follower, a girl manipulated by someone older, someone she trusted. They argued that she hadn't wanted the robbery to turn violent, that she never wanted anyone to die. But the jury couldn't look past the outcome. A man was gone forever, and Shavonne had helped create the circumstances that killed him. The verdict came swiftly: guilty. At 16 years old, Shavonne Robbins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The weight of that sentence fell heavy. She was still in her teens when the prison gates closed behind her, knowing she would grow old inside, never again tasting freedom. Today, decades later, Shavonne remains incarcerated in Pennsylvania. She has spent far more of her life in prison than outside it. Whatever youthful thrill she once thought she was chasing evaporated long ago, replaced by the endless repetition of prison life. The tragedy of her case lies in the collision of youth and consequence. Shavonne wasn't a mastermind, nor the one who pulled the trigger. She chose to follow, to participate, to step into a plan that ended in irreversible violence. And the law gave her the same punishment as the one who struck the fatal blow. For the victim's family, the loss was permanent. A loved one taken in a robbery that should never have happened, gone because two people decided money was worth more than human life. For Shavonne, the punishment is just as permanent. 16 when she went in. Life without parole. A sentence as long as her victim's absence. Her story stands as a stark reminder that even when you're not the one holding the weapon, choices can bind you to the consequences forever. And for Shavonne Robbins, that meant trading her teenage years, her adulthood, and her future for a lifetime inside a Pennsylvania prison. 7. Elizabeth Turpin. Some murders erupt in seconds. A burst of rage, a flash of violence. But others are planted like seeds, watered by resentment, and grown carefully in the shadows until they bloom into betrayal. Elizabeth Turpin's crime was the latter. She didn't strike in anger. She plotted in silence. And when her plan finally unfolded in 1986, it ended with her young husband lying at the bottom of a Kentucky river. Elizabeth was just 20 years old when she married Michael Turpin. At first, their lives seemed like the start of a fairy tale. They were young, attractive, building a life together in Lexington. But behind closed doors, Elizabeth grew restless. The excitement of marriage wore off, replaced by frustration and a hunger for something more. She had taken a lover, Karen Brown, and with that secret came a dangerous question. What if Michael were no longer in the picture? What began as whispered conversations of frustration soon hardened into a plot. Elizabeth wasn't content to simply leave her husband. Divorce wasn't enough. She wanted him gone. Permanently. And so she enlisted help. Karen Brown, her lover, and Keith Bouchard, a friend willing to get his hands dirty. Together, they conspired to eliminate Michael once and for all. On February 3rd, 1986, Elizabeth set her plan in motion. She lured Michael home under the guise of an ordinary evening. To him, it was just another night. To her, it was the culmination of weeks of scheming. When Michael stepped inside, he had no idea he was walking into a trap laid by his own wife. As Michael entered the apartment, he was ambushed. Keith attacked him with brutal force, stabbing him repeatedly. Michael fought, struggled, but the assault was overwhelming. In minutes, the young husband's life was drained from him. Elizabeth didn't raise the knife, but she had orchestrated every detail, watching her plan unfold with chilling calm. Once the attack was complete, the conspirators moved to cover their tracks. Michael's body was stuffed into the trunk of a car and driven to a remote location. There, it was dumped into the Kentucky River, weighed down in the hope it would never surface. To Elizabeth, it was supposed to be the perfect crime, a husband erased, a new life waiting with her lover. But perfection crumbled quickly. Within days, Michael's disappearance raised alarms. His friends and co-workers grew suspicious. Police began asking questions, and when Michael's body was pulled from the river, the brutality of his murder was unmistakable. The investigation quickly unraveled Elizabeth's carefully spun lies. Witnesses came forward pointing to her affair with Karen. Evidence tied her to the conspiracy. The threads of her plot were exposed one by one until the whole web collapsed. At trial, prosecutors portrayed Elizabeth as the architect, a young woman who chose betrayal over loyalty, who weaponized intimacy to destroy the man who trusted her most. Karen Brown and Keith Bouchard faced justice too, but Elizabeth was the centerpiece, the betrayer whose name would forever be linked to her husband's death. The defense tried to cast doubt, to frame Elizabeth as less culpable, arguing she hadn't wielded the knife herself. But the jury saw through it. She hadn't needed to stab him to be guilty. She had written the script, cast the accomplices, and set the murder in motion. Without her, Michael Turpin would still have been alive. The verdict: guilty. Elizabeth Turpin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. For someone just in her early 20s, it was a sentence that stretched out like an eternity. Karen Brown and Keith Bouchard also received life terms, their lives bound together by a single night of betrayal. Today, Elizabeth remains behind bars in Kentucky, decades older. The fairy tale bride image, long gone. She entered prison as a young woman with her entire adult life ahead of her. Now, her future is reduced to the routines of incarceration. Her name still synonymous with one of the most infamous spousal murders in the state. What makes Elizabeth's crime unforgettable is the calculation. Unlike crimes of passion, her betrayal was deliberate, planned, executed step by step. She chose to erase her husband not with a moment of violence, but with a scheme rooted in manipulation and cold resolve. For Michael's family, the loss was compounded by the cruel irony of it all. The person who vowed to love him forever had conspired to end his life. His body was buried in Kentucky soil, but the memory of his murder haunts the state's history of crime. Elizabeth Turpin's story remains a chilling example of how trust can be twisted into a weapon, how love can rot into treachery, and how a marriage can end not in separation, but in blood. 8. Erica Sheppard. The knock at the door was never coming. Instead, the terror arrived uninvited. For 43-year-old Marilyn Sage, a woman living in Port Arthur, Texas, the night of June 30, 1993, was the last she would ever see. Her life ended not in an accident, not by illness, but at the hands of two intruders who turned her home into a stage of cruelty. Among them was a teenage girl named Erica Sheppard, just 19, yet capable of a crime so violent that she became one of the rare women on Texas's death row. Erica's life before the crime was a chain of hardship and instability. Raised in Houston, she grew up in poverty, moving from place to place, sometimes with relatives, sometimes with foster care. Her childhood was fractured, filled with neglect and abuse. By her late teens, she had fallen into the company of hardened criminals, older figures who wielded influence over her. But nothing in her background excused what happened the night she and her accomplice forced their way into Marilyn Sage's home. The plan was simple: rob the house, steal valuables, and get out. Marilyn was a local woman living alone, chosen because she seemed vulnerable. Erica and her partner, James Dickerson, believed it would be quick and easy. But the reality was anything but. Once inside, the robbery spiraled into savagery. Marilyn was confronted in her own home, terror flooding the very space meant to keep her safe. She was beaten, her body forced down, as the intruders demanded money and possessions. But robbery wasn't enough. The attack escalated into a killing, not fast, not merciful, but prolonged and sadistic. Marilyn was strangled with a cord, the pressure crushing the life out of her. As if that weren't enough, she was stabbed multiple times, each wound a reminder of the cruelty unleashed that night. Her home became a scene of horror, furniture overturned, valuables ransacked, and her lifeless body left behind. The brutality shocked investigators. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was overkill. Violence carried out not just to steal, but to dominate, to humiliate, to destroy. And when detectives pieced together the crime, Erica Sheppard's name surfaced quickly. Evidence tied her to the home. Witnesses placed her with Dickerson, and soon she was in custody, staring down charges that carried the ultimate punishment. At trial, the prosecution didn't hold back. They portrayed Erica as a willing participant, someone who not only joined the robbery, but also took part in the murder itself. The strangulation, the stabbing, both were linked directly to her. The cruelty of Marilyn's final moments weighed heavy in the courtroom, every detail painting Erica as more than just an accomplice. The defense tried to argue that Erica had been under the influence of Dickerson, pressured and manipulated by an older male accomplice. They presented her as a girl from a broken past, swept into something she couldn't control, but the evidence was too strong, the violence too brutal. The jury saw not a victim of circumstance, but an active participant in a sadistic killing. The verdict? Guilty. And then, the sentence that set Erica apart from almost every other young woman convicted of murder in America. The jury handed down death. She was sent to the Mountain View unit in Texas, one of the very few women on death row, awaiting execution for the crime she committed at 19 years old. Her accomplice, James Dickerson, also faced justice, receiving his own death sentence. But Erica's role stood out. She wasn't just along for the ride. She had put her hands on the cord, her hands on the knife. The cruelty was shared, and so was the punishment. Today, Erica remains on death row, decades after the crime. Appeals have delayed her execution, but the sentence hangs over her life like a shadow she cannot escape. She is one of the youngest women ever condemned to die in Texas for murder. Her name etched into the short, grim list of female death row inmates. For Marilyn Sage's family, the grief never ended. Their loved one's final moments were filled with terror and pain, her life taken in a way no human should endure. And for Texas, the case became another reminder that age does not limit cruelty. At 19, Erica Sheppard crossed a line so violent that society answered with the harshest punishment it could deliver. Her story remains distinct among the others, not only for the brutality of the crime, but for the consequence. Life without parole was not enough. For Erica, the state of Texas decided the price of her actions would be death. Of teenage girls who chose paths so violent, so irreversible, that their futures were locked away behind steel bars. From Natasha Cornett and Karen Howell, who helped wipe out an entire family on a Tennessee back road, to Sarah Marie Johnson, who silenced her own parents in their Idaho home, to Carly Madison Gregg, who turned her rage on her mother in Mississippi. Each case showed how youth does not erase cruelty. And then Britnee Miller in Florida, who lured her friend to a betrayal masked as friendship. Shavonne Robbins in Pennsylvania, whose taste for a quick robbery left a man dead and her condemned for life. Elizabeth Turpin in Kentucky, who plotted her husband's execution with chilling calculation. and Erica Sheppard in Texas, the only one of them sentenced to death for a sadistic home invasion that ended in blood. Each girl was a teenager. Each crime was deliberate. And every sentence was a reminder that choices made in youth can carve a destiny of lifelong punishment. But beyond the names of the killers, we must not forget the victims. Their families left with grief that never fades. And now I want to hear from you. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Which story stayed with you after the screen went dark? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What time are you watching this video? And where in the world are you watching from? If this episode kept you watching, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories that expose the darkest corners of human nature. And hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Because these aren't just tales of crime. They're reminders of how choices, no matter how young the person making them, can echo forever.